Thanks for joining me. I'm Ed Shapiro. I'm a psychiatrist, a psychoanalyst, and an organizational consultant. I've been studying for most of my career individuals, families, organizations, and more recently citizens, trying to unpack the psychological steps behind active citizenship. What I've learned in my work is that finding a voice and claiming a place in society are central aspects of psychological health and of active citizenship. Given what's happening around us, many of us are feeling powerless, unable to participate, even though we recognize that participation is essential if we want to preclude the advent of autocracy. We're desperate to figure it out, but it's hard for us to figure out how, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. There are two questions I'd like you to hold on to as I go through this material. The first question represents a disciplined way of listening, and in particular to listen to polarized political arguments. How are they right? It is so gratifying for us to listen to how they're wrong, how they have the wrong perspective, how they're not listening to the right people, how they have the wrong tradition. It gratifies us, it diminishes them, and it's enormously pleasing. Listening for how they are right is more difficult. I'm not suggesting that we listen to how they are completely right, because that's a surrender of our own perspective, but rather to listen hard for those aspects of what they are saying that might resonate with our experience or with the task that we're trying to work at. I'll try to show you how that works. The second question is, why do I have to do this? This question comes up around social demand, when we feel pulled to participate in a particular way that might be a bit risky. The usual response to our asking ourselves this question, why do I have to do this, is, I don't. Somebody else will do it, and we abdicate the possibility. I will try to show you that there is inevitably an affirmative answer to this question. And when we discover it, it is an opportunity for learning and for development. It requires slowing down, and I'll try to show you what I mean. Our world is facing us with a number of challenges. We're being torn apart by political polarization. The chaos in the world around us has left many of us filled with helplessness, depression, despair, and isolation. The escalating war abroad and the political crisis at home demand active citizenship. We are recognizing, without our engagement, that chaos and authoritarianism flourish. Let me begin by outlining the shape of this presentation. We are born into families, and we take up our first membership role there. We emerge from our families as individuals, and we look out into the world, and this is what we see. This enormous globe filled with chaos, confusion, and complexity. People struggling with each other against different ethnic and national identities, against different religious commitments, different economic stresses, different political persuasions. It is too chaotic and too confusing and too complicated for any individual to wrap their mind around. What we need are some kind of intermediate spaces where we can gather with others around shared values and look together at some aspect of the world that we can begin to make sense of. Those intermediate spaces are provided by institutions. Focusing on institutions, I want to try to show you how their missions can help authorize our voices as citizens. During 2 presidential elections in America, I studied voters across the country and across different political persuasions. What I discovered was that despite their political differences, Americans have one thing in common, and that is a commitment to values. They want to be respected for who they are, and they have a longing to join some kind of moral community where they can gather with others around shared values. But moral communities are increasingly difficult to find. Long before the pandemic, religious institutions exploited children. Educational institutions underpaid and bureaucratized the teachers of our children. Healthcare institutions seem to manage more paperwork than patients. Politicians support the needs of companies, not citizens, and commercial institutions inevitably focus on money, not meaning, with one exception. During the war in Ukraine, over 1,000 commercial institutions, against their economic incentives, withdrew from Russia. But with that exception, it has become increasingly difficult to connect the missions of our institutions with the needs of society. As a consequence, many of us are finding it difficult to participate. We hang back from joining institutions. We experience them as these enormous things with powerful authority structures. But they're actually only human systems, and therefore we can and we must influence them to address the needs of society. In this presentation, focusing on institutions, I will lay out the steps to active citizenship using several stories. Here's the first one. Thomas is a 50-year-old black West Indian British citizen. He told me this story about an event that happened to him. A number of years ago, the firemen in London went on strike. They stopped being available. It produced chaos in London. It didn't last very long, but during the number of weeks when this work stoppage happened, there was chaos in the society. Fires were being lit on the streets. People were protesting. There were racial tensions. It was a mess. And Thomas was riding on a London bus at night during the midst of the strike. Sirens, chaos outside. On the bus was a white bus driver, Thomas, and several white citizens, and in the back of the bus, a group of black West Indian British boys who began to hassle the white bus driver using racial epithets. None of the white passengers moved. Thomas looked around the bus and said to himself, "Why do I have to do this?" It's a very interesting question. But once you raise that question, there are a whole set of other questions that come up. Who am I? What do I stand for? What do I represent? And why now do I feel moved to act? Who we are is shaped by our contexts and their embedded values. Our families, our professions, our institutions with their missions. When we take up the role of citizen, we represent those contexts and the values that have shaped who we are, whether we notice it or not. Finding our voice and a place in society requires coming to terms with what we represent. So what do we represent, and how do we figure it out? A number of months ago, I was consulting to a small group at a conference, and a young female black psychiatrist said to me, "When you speak, my mind goes blank." She made it clear that that reaction had nothing to do with what I was saying, nothing to do with my ideas. It had to do with what she felt and saw when she looked at me, a senior, old, white, privileged man. What she saw was a representative of the other, the history of trauma, of white oppression of black people during slavery. My initial reaction to that attribution was, no, not me. My grandparents came from the Ukraine. But as I thought about it, I recognized that if my American identity means anything to me, and it certainly does, then I have to take on board and consider what I represent to others. I have to listen to how is she right. If I accept that attribution with its negative connotations, then I join history. I join a shared social context as a member. What we represent is not something that we can assert based on our knowledge of our own complicated selves. It is something that is negotiated with others, and to do that, we have to listen to how they're right. That representation comes through our families, through our institutions, and through society. It is possible that if we pay attention to this, we might recognize the ways in which each of us represents a mission. But in order to do that, we have to spend a little more time considering institutions and how they work, because institutions are engaged in society on our behalf. Let me give you a rather simple definition of institutions. Institutions have an inner world that consists of people and roles, and it faces an outer world that has needs. And there's a boundary between the institution and the outer world, which consists of a mission. The mission is the way that institution begins to shape itself to meet the needs of the outside world. Though we don't ordinarily notice it, we are born into an institution. The family is our first institution. Like any institution, the family has an inner world with people in roles: father role, mother role, oldest child role, and it faces a world with needs. The particular need that the family is shaped to meet is the need of the outside world for mature adults. So the mission of the family then is development toward maturity. In the family, it holds dependency and independency, it provides loving connections, and the family works in concert with the community to develop mature adults. In our families, we learn about membership, roles, mission, and values. Role is a complicated notion. A role is the place where the individual and the context come together. Each role is a function of a mission. The father role is a way of taking up the developmental mission of the family. The nursing role is a particular aspect of taking up the treatment mission of a healthcare institution. In families, people are in roles, but they don't always notice that they're in a family group and that they're relating to a developmental mission, so they get into relationships with one another that are not necessarily mission-related. When they are mission-related, then the roles fit together. The father role and the mother role collaborate in the developmental mission, as does the sibling role. That's an interconnected set of role relationships that are mission-related. That's not always the case in families. Let me show you why. A number of years ago, when my son Joshua was 5, he and my wife Donna and I were in California, and we were walking along a cliff, a path near the ocean. Donna and Josh were walking up front, and I was walking behind. And as we were walking, the path began to narrow at the edge of the cliff. And Donna said to Josh, let me walk on the outside here. And Josh, being an inquisitive kid, said to her, why? And she said, well, you know, the path is getting narrow, and if somebody has to slip, I'd rather it be me. Josh hesitated for a minute, looked up at her, and he said, I'd rather it be Dad. At that moment, he and his mother were in a relationship, and I was the other. I was outside. I was the third party. It happens in families that people get extruded. It's transient, and it disappears when we are working together. And when we are working together in relation to the developmental mission, I shift from the role of other to one of us. Shifting from the role of other to one of us is one of the key ideas that I'd like you to pay attention to. The family mission incorporates ideals and values. All missions represent a set of values, and it is those values and the mission that can mobilize us and bring us together. It transforms the other into one of us. Here is a striking example of what I mean. When COVID began, we were all locked up in our rooms, panicked. We knew that there were not enough ventilators, and we were afraid, very afraid, that we might die alone by suffocation. We watched people standing outside as people that they loved couldn't breathe. And then, in the midst of the pandemic, as we're sitting at home, we watched on TV as a white policeman put his knee on the neck of a black man as that man cried, "I can't breathe." And all of us thought, that could be me. And all of a sudden, the values that are derived from our families and our organizations were mobilized, and we discovered our roles as citizens. Millions of us were on the streets. We were all members of humanity. Look at this crowd. We had discovered shared values and ideals. Racial bias is arbitrary and hideous. No one should be executed without due process. Authority must be held to account. Once on the streets, all of our differences disappeared. We were all potentially attacked by the same virus. We all lived on the same threatened planet, and we all faced systems of authority that could too easily become arbitrary, coercive, and punitive. We had discovered our voices and a beginning place in society. But street protests are not enough. We need institutions to develop a shared view of society. And though the values embedded in our institutions' mission might be out of our awareness, they still have a mobilizing impact. Here's the next story. A number of years ago, at the beginning of my career, I ran a small program at McLean Hospital in Boston. McLean is a psychiatric hospital affiliated with the Mass General Hospital and with Harvard Medical School. While I was there, the trustees of the Mass General recognized that they needed additional funds for new buildings and expanding their larger operation. They decided that they would try to sell McLean Hospital to a for-profit chain. They anticipated that the faculty of McLean would have little response to such sale because many of us had private practices outside of the institution, but they were completely wrong. To their amazement, the faculty recognized that the several hours that they spent at McLean were the most important of their professional career. They discovered that the values and beliefs of the academic and clinical mission mattered enormously to them, and they organized a petition to Harvard Medical School to try to get them to convince the trustees not to sell the institution. Discovering how the mission mattered allowed them to risk their job by going against their leaders. They were authorized by that mission and a set of values that mattered. Now, I was a young faculty member growing up against authority of the Harvard Medical School and faced the Hall of Professors. The Hall of Professors is a long hall in the medical school building with pictures of Nobel Prize winning professors around the walls, a long table with high-back chairs, and all of the tenured professors in line. I was sitting at the head of the table presenting this petition, and in case you don't know what that feels like, let me show you. This is what it felt like walking into that room. They were wonderful. The professors completely agreed with the faculty's position, and they argued successfully against the sale of McLean Hospital. We learned an enormous amount from this event about the power of mission to bring people together and mobilize them around a set of values. The next question, however, comes up about the shaping of the mission. How do people in the institution work together, as the faculty began to do in the McLean story, to begin to shape the mission more precisely so that everybody can hold it? A young psychologist was hired to develop a new child clinic in a larger mental health institution. She had an office with a desk and a chair, and some little chairs for the kids. Periodically, her male supervisor would come into her office, sit on her desk, and put his feet on the chairs. That bothered her, but she couldn't find a way to say anything to her supervisor because he was her boss and she didn't want to offend him. So here's the question. Is it possible in an institution to develop a culture whereby each staff member recognizes that in their role they represent a function of the mission, and that behavior across roles represents work at clarifying the mission, even painful experience, could be considered as work. If that culture could be created, and I recognize it wouldn't be easy, then she could say to her supervisor, when you put your feet on these little chairs, it bothers me. And the supervisor could think, she's speaking as a representative of the mission, and so am I. Is it possible that without my paying attention to it, my putting my feet on these little chairs is speaking about my perception of the implication of this child clinic for the institution? Could my behavior and her reaction to it represent an effort to clarify the mission, to clarify our ambivalence about the meaning of the child clinic for our evolving institutional mission? If they could do that, that would be leadership from below, and they could then bring their thinking collaboratively to a larger institutional discussion and help shape the mission. This is a hard sell. I recognize it would be hard to do, to put people's narcissistic injuries aside so they can recognize that painful experience and role is work toward a mission is something that we might be able to do if we turned our mind to it. The shape of a mission and its incorporation of values and ideals matter. In my experience, too often the mission statement of institutions are relegated to 5 or 6 pages that staff members send people to look at. They don't own it. The statement is usually filled with platitudes, doesn't differentiate the institution from other institutions, and nobody holds on to it. For it to help us find our places in society, the mission needs to be clear and powerful. In the best of all possible worlds, we can get it into one sentence that everybody recognizes and hold on to. That takes work. But let me give you some examples. If I work in an airplane factory and our mission is we make the best airplane widgets, then I go to work as a technician. And at the end of the day, I go home and I leave my work behind. If, however, the mission is we help defend the nation, and that mission matters to me and touches the values and beliefs that are central to my life, then I bring all of myself to work. That's an example. Let me give you another one. When Apple was formed by Steve Jobs, the mission that he and his colleagues developed was this one. We make tools for the mind that advance humankind. That mission is clear, represents a set of ideals and values, and hooks on to the developmental need for the advancement of humankind that people actually believe in. Let me give you a third example, and this one in more detail because it reflects the institution that I was involved in. The Austin Riggs Center. When I first came to Riggs, having thought about these issues ahead of time, I had a year before I arrived. I was in Boston and Riggs was in Western Massachusetts, and I invited the staff, the patients, and the Board of Trustees, each one of those 3 groups, to form a group and articulate their view of the mission in a paragraph. Each one did. They were all different and interesting, and then I asked them each to authorize a representative across for each group and negotiate a shared mission. And then I asked them to negotiate the mission with me. And here's what we came up with over time. Riggs helps so-called treatment-resistant patients become people taking charge of their lives. That's a mission that reflects the labels that patients had when they were sent to us and the transformation that we helped them engage in. It's a mission about authority, and it gave a lens onto the outside world. How do people actually take up authority for their own lives, for gaining a voice and finding a place in society? That's the background of what I'm trying to talk to you about. When the mission is clear, the articulation of the specific values and beliefs that relate to that mission gets easier to do. So the values embedded in Riggs' mission are affirmation, of the dignity and responsibility of the individual. Recognition, appreciation, and enhancement of individual strengths, respect for individual differences, and attention to the potential conflict between the needs of the individual and the requirements of the community. When the mission is clear in this way, with embedded ideals and values that matter to us, we join the mission more deeply than we join leaders. That joining we don't pay attention to very often. That joining shapes who we are and helps us to articulate what belongs to us. That transformative joining of a mission has freed whistleblowers, for example, to take the risk to speak up about leaders and organizations that have lost sight of the mission. We saw the courage of whistleblowers during Donald Trump's presidency, and the McLean example is a similar one. But whistleblowers need outside systems who can listen. So let me tell you a story about whistleblowers. An 8-year-old boy was hospitalized at a state hospital because of what the police called unmanageable aggression. Here's the story. He's the youngest child in a family of 10 children with a single mother. She had more than she could manage. But one day she took all of the kids to a supermarket. When they were there, some of the older kids started fooling around, and then all the kids got involved. They were knocking things off of shelves, spilling things on the floor. The customers got upset. The manager was called. The mother was beginning to get angry. And the boy, the youngest, went over to one of the shelves and he pulled out a can of Raid. He opened the can and he sprayed it on his siblings. Went into their eyes and they were enraged. Their chaos escalated. The people in the store were upset. The mother was screaming. The manager came over and called the police. And when the police came, the mother said, "I just can't manage this kid." And they took him off to the hospital. In the hospital, the resident who worked the child up met with him and found him calm, organized, and well-behaved. She was irritated at having to write up this case when she had so much else to manage in this chaotic system, and so she brought it to the seminar that I was running with all of the residents who were working there. Everybody was overwhelmed because it was such a busy system. And the resident talked about her guilt, about her irritation. She felt guilty about it because she thought a good doctor should take care of her patient and not want to get rid of him. One of the fellows in the seminar said, we're all overwhelmed, you're all overwhelmed, and this mother is also overwhelmed. And she, like you, might be angry about her child's behavior and guilty about her wish to get rid of him. That was very helpful to the resident who wrote up the case. And then one of the fellows in the seminar said, he started laughing. He said, maybe this boy empathized with the mother's distress and overwhelm, and maybe he grabbed the can of Raid and sprayed his siblings because he was trying to help her get rid of the pests. Everybody thought that was very funny. Everybody laughed and relaxed. And that allowed the resident to go meet with the mother. And when she met with the mother and said, with a smile, maybe this boy was trying to help you get rid of the pests, the mother started laughing and relaxed and had a different notion about her kid's behavior. And she was no longer so frightened by it. And she was able to go back to her family and help them mobilize their own resources. Okay. When a family representative, which this boy was, carrying the system's irrationality, bursts out into the larger community, we psychiatrists call these people patients. But they're actually citizens, whistleblowers, people who have found their voices and their place in society and their representation of an institution, a family institution, that has lost sight of its developmental mission and is in trouble. The application of this to society is straightforward. When people are too marginalized to speak, essential communications burst out through unmanaged behavior. When that happens in society, we need institutions that can help translate that behavior into words. We're beginning to recognize that. The protesters during George Floyd yelled out, "Defund the police." I think what they really meant was, can we shift some funds from the police's job of containing behavior to the social service job of understanding it in order to help the community develop its own resources? Okay. I've talked about polarization. I've talked about the power of mission to bring people together. I've talked about the need to articulate and shape the mission so that everybody feels it and connects it to their values and beliefs. I've begun to describe how you can negotiate within an institution. If people take seriously their experiences and roles, you can sharpen the mission from inside of the institution. And I've begun to talk about whistleblowers and the kinds of interinstitutional communications that can happen that can help strengthen the bonds of society. What I have not said anything about yet is the role of leaders. Leaders are at the external boundary of the institution. They sharpen the mission, they mobilize internal resources, they negotiate with the larger society, and they authorize leadership from below. We all know this, and one of the best examples of competent leadership in relation to mission is this one. During the war in Ukraine, Zelensky and his team provided a superb example of competent leadership. They mobilized their nation, they represented their nation to the outside world, and they were able to communicate to the rest of us the ways in which Ukraine and its struggle against Russia represented values and beliefs that we all actually believe in. We learned and accepted that they were fighting and dying on our behalf. They found their voices and claimed a place in the larger society. So, let me go back to my beginning story. You remember Thomas on the bus. There's a fireman strike outside, chaos, racial tensions. The black kids in the back of the bus are hassling the white bus driver. The white passengers aren't moving, and Thomas says to himself, "Why do I have to do this?" I told you at the beginning there's an affirmative answer to this question. What is it for Thomas? To answer this question, Thomas has to first think, who am I? So who is Thomas? He's a representative of the West Indian subculture. He's irritated by the kids' anger because it casts an unfavorable view of that subculture. But at the same time, he recognizes it, he might even have identified with it, and he's not afraid of it. He's a member of the Anglican Church, and through the mission of the Church, he recognizes the transcendent interdependency of humanity. We are all God's children. And he recognizes the vulnerability of the larger society. He's a social worker. And through the mission of social work, which is about improving social problems, he recognizes and understands the reluctance of the white passengers to potentially escalate racial tension. And he is a father. And through that role in the family institution, he recognizes the adolescent's need for a paternal presence at the moment of their rebellion against authority. Thomas identifies with all aspects of his identities. He integrates the values and beliefs embedded in his institutional missions, finding his own integrity, a lens onto society, and a citizen voice. Thomas recognizes who he is, and he accepts what he represents to others. He sees that only he in the bus can do this, and he discovers the role of the active citizen. If society is at stake, I'm at stake. Thomas has discovered his integrity. Integrity, as defined by the psychoanalyst Erik Erikson, is our obligation to the most mature meaning available to us, even if this risky commitment should bring discomfort to ourselves, deprivation to our mates and offspring, and the loss of friends, all of which, according to Erikson, must be imagined and endured in order not to be exposed to a final sense of disgust and despair. In Erikson's view, integrity requires the discovery of social tasks to which the individual can become committed. Thomas's integrity required that he take a stand, and he asked the boys to back off, and they did. But taking up the role of active citizen can have painful consequences. During World War II, the parents of a very young girl in Germany decided to hide a Jewish boy in their basement to protect him from the Nazis. These parents, struggling with their values and beliefs, the developmental mission of the family, and their sense of citizenship, took an enormous risk. While their child was very young, the holding environment of the family provided her with a sense of safety and security. But when she reached adolescence, she told her analyst how enraged she was at her parents for risking her life. This young woman and her family had more work to do to help her to discover her link to her parents' integrity. The story illustrates the way institutional work at a mission is ongoing. It changes when external and internal events change, and it is always being renegotiated. Active citizenship does not come easily, but it requires a focused attention to our institutions and to their missions to make it more likely. Let me review with you the steps institutions might usefully take in developing and shaping their missions. When refining an institutional mission, focus on what's unique about this particular institution, its history, its traditions, its resources and skills, and the environment in which it's located. Missions are held in the mind, both internally and externally. Solicit and authorize the perspectives of stakeholders, both the staff and the people outside who use the institution and rely on it. Authorize their perspectives. Clarify the particular need of society that the mission is attempting to meet and articulate the shared values. Delegate authority and shape each management structure with a clear link to the mission that will lead to collective ownership. Institutional leaders should make public their sense of their experience and role. This is what's happening to me. This is how I understand it. This is what I'm learning about the mission. And acknowledge your blind spots and your dependency on the staff to help you see what you couldn't, without their help, understand. That authorizes leadership from below. Study the behavior of staff as communication about the mission, and help create a culture where staff members don't just see each other as individuals, but also as representatives of the mission. When I first came to Riggs and joined the staff as the leader, I sat at the head of the table at lunch, and several staff members told me not to sit there. When I asked why, they told me that the seat was reserved for a senior clinician who represented the tradition. That taught me about the importance of tradition in the mission of the institution. When there are outside pressures on the institution that threaten your work, try to listen to them as information about how we might refine the mission to incorporate those pressures and more clearly relate to a changing external need. Missions are always in the process of renegotiation as the world changes. And try to articulate the mission in one simple statement that everybody can hold on to. Our institutions need us to help them refine their missions to more clearly address the needs of society. And all of that leads to my recommendation to you to join an institution and use their perspectives to help you become more active citizens. So here are the steps to active citizenship. Remember, institutions are not things. They're human systems, that's all they are, that you can help shape. Join one that fits who you are and find ways to bring yourself fully into your role. Recognize, accept, and use what you represent to others. Focus on your role and on your experience in role, which allows you to hold the task, the mission, as primary. Listen to others in terms of how they're right. Discover how they are working at the mission. And use that learning to lead from below to help sharpen the mission, as I described in the psychologist story. Find ways to answer the question, what social need does this mission address? Help others recognize how the mission and values are a lens onto society, and use that lens to authorize your voices as citizens. So, as we approach the end of my presentation, let's review where we have been. So much of our family, institutional, and political lives are full of sometimes irrational intensity that we can lose sight of the power of joining a mission beyond ourselves. In the bus story, Thomas found his way. But most of us are more like the boys in the back of the bus, the single mother in the supermarket, the German daughter who felt betrayed in her family. We can get lost, and we need other members and a clear mission to find our way. We are born into families, and we learn there about membership, roles, and mission. We leave the family as representatives, and we bring the family role into our institutions. If the mission is clear, we can link with other members to develop a shared view of society's needs. As adults, we can reach for our own integrity as we discover the role of active citizen. Our institutions give us a voice and a place to stand in society. The problems we're struggling with of othering, of turning people into unrelated others, are not easily solved. But if we can find ways to shift from using relationships to export blame and responsibility, to using our experiences in institutional roles to address shared problems, then we can help transform the other into one of us. And all of this will lead to a heightened clarity about the world and an increased possibility that we will take the risk to become an active citizen. So in closing, let me remind you of the two questions that I asked you to keep in mind. How are they right is an approach to listening that increases the odds that you won't get lost in polarized thinking. And why do I have to do this is a question that has an answer, and that answer is not somebody else will do it. When that question comes up for you, I recommend that you give yourself some reflective time to find the answer. You will learn from it. These two questions, in the context of becoming part of an institution, might just help you to find your way. Thank you very much for listening to me.